Chapter 11. Enter Goons. Up to this point in the history of EVE Online, there is a relatively clear progression of power. For the most part, those who began playing the game in 2003 had clear advantages over those who started in 2004. Their knowledge of the game was far greater. Their pockets were far deeper, and their hangars were filled with more advanced ships. However, that began to change in 2004 with a unique event, a migration. Many new players from all corners of the internet began to experiment with EVE. All the original powers of EVE Online migrated from different games that preceded EVE, Earth and Beyond, Homeworld, Jump Gate, Elite, and etc. But this was one of the first major arrivals of new players since then. These types of players and fluxes had been rare in the past because for about the first 18 months of its lifespan, EVE Online was sold in a box in stores. The game was originally published by Simon & Schuster Interactive, a branch of the well-known book publisher that dabbled in games distribution, but the interactive branch of the company was shut down. That meant that EVE Online's distribution rights now belonged to a company that no longer distributed games. It took CCP Games some time to negotiate and buy back the rights to distribute the game. EVE Online was not yet a hit, and CCP Games could have simply let EVE perish and moved on to creating a new title. But the company stuck by it and opted to negotiate for the right to continue working on their own game. CCP Games got the rights back in its possession, but it was hardly capable of distributing a box video game internationally from its Icelandic headquarters. And so the company decided to take a big risk. It began selling EVE exclusively through the internet. Sorry about my cat, nothing I can do about that. He's fed, he has food, he has everything he needs, and cuddles too. EVE exclusively through the internet. This gave EVE the ability to become a viral hit. On several different corners of the internet, established EVE players began recruiting others to join since they could not easily download it over the internet. This allowed for a new influx of players from many different backgrounds. No longer was every major player group a descendant of a different space-based online strategy game. One small group of players hailed from the forums of the site somethingawful.com, whose members called themselves the Goons. The Goons that joined EVE Online would one day be legendary, but they began humbly. I'll be right back. The cat. Eight failed dreams. The first Goon Corporation was torn apart by internal squabbling, but the Goons reformed elsewhere as Red Hammer Industries, which was similarly shattered. This time, it wasn't drama that hobbled the nascent Goon presence, but theft. A Goon with access to the main hangar absconded with billions of ISK worth of materials, mostly minerals and mining yield. The thief was never caught, and the resulting fracas tore the young corporation apart. The next Goon alliance, called Free State Project, fell apart after Goon stole ore from a larger enemy corporation that then used the theft as cause to begin killing any Goon they saw. The members scattered shortly after. On and on it went. 8 times the Goon organized themselves, and 8 times they were scattered for different reasons. I quote, "Goon corporations in EVE have been a history of failed dreams," wrote Remedial, the first major leader. Eventually, a few Goons came together to form yet another corporation called Goon Fleet. At its core, Goon Fleet had several veterans of EVE Online, but the bulk of of its membership were new players in the game who had been encouraged to join EVE by their friends at somethingawful.com. In the series of recruitment drives, Goon Fleet pilots invited other goons to join the game. The organization didn't have grand ambitions of space conquest. The goons just liked to get as many people online as possible, in the crappiest ships possible, to see what they could pull off. The key difference between Goon Fleet and the failed corporation of the past was an emphasis on teaching beginners. Goon Fleet lavished attention on players who were just joining the game, and took time to teach them the basics. While other players in EVE would scoff at new players and refuse to recruit anyone who wasn't a trusted friend or a renowned veteran, the goons welcomed new players, provided they were true-blood goons with a history on the somethingawful.com forums. The new approach to dealing with new players drove hundreds of new players to join Goon Fleet. With the direction of their leader, Remedial, more and more players joined the game under the Goon Fleet banner. The corporation grew to over 1,000 members, too large to simply fall apart from internal drama, and it became I'm sorry, I was still in mumble. Not aware. Let me fix that. There we go. Start over. So, with the direction of their leader, Remedial, more and more players joined the game under the Goon Fleet banner. The corporation grew to over 1,000 members, too large to simply fall apart from internal drama, and became the sideshow of EVE Online. The veterans of EVE Online laughed at the naivety of this swarming packs of new players in terrible ships. Goon Fleet embraced the idea and co-opted the idea of the swarm for its own image. Its pilots adopted the mascot of a chubby, cigar-smoking bumblebee wearing a World War I era German helmet, which they appropriately named Fat B. Their battle cry: "We're terrible at this game." Many in the EVE universe at the time wrote off Goon Fleet as a swarm of internet trolls who just wanted to ruin everyone's day. There was some of truth to that. The goons would openly use coarse language that made many people uncomfortable. To be clear, their use of slurs and other harsh language is common in many online communities, and EVE Online is no exception. What made the goons unique in the EVE community wasn't their use of this kind of language, but their use of it in alliance-level communications, in leadership speeches, and so on. The goons refused to change the way they talked or acted, regardless of whether their audience was a few friends, a few thousand alliance mates, or tens of thousands in the wider EVE community. They mocked the pomp and pageantry with which other leaders at the time carried themselves. There was an authenticity to the blue-collar attitude of the goons, and it proved to be a great social strength of the organization. But behind the irreverent attitude, there was a social genius to the way the goons approached the game. In essence, their morale was unassailable, because they deliberately underinflated their self-image. According to some sources, the name Goon was intended as a way of turning the stereotype of basement-dwelling internet cretins against itself by publicly owning it. The goons of EVE Online demeaned themselves publicly and claimed to not care what happened to their ships or their territory. This was in stark contrast to how things had been run before the goons' arrivals. This was in stark contrast to how things had been run before the goons' arrival in New Eden. For some of the best players groups in the game, pride was a resource. Skilled pilots could build up their egos after winning a string of battles, but it was only a matter of time until they were humbled. And when they were, the illusion of mastery could unfold and unravel the social fabric of the group. If your corporation is based on being the best, what happens when you lose? The goons prided themselves on being the worst, so when they lost, they laughed. When they won, they laughed harder. The goons represented a new crop of EVE Online players, and some of the old guard didn't like them at all. Groups like Band of Brothers tended to view them as disrespectful of the history and power structure of the game. I quote, "They had this attitude of, we can do whatever we want, we can say whatever we want, nobody's going to hold us accountable for our actions," said Band of Brothers Sir Moldy in 2014, who was essentially the most powerful person in New Eden at the time of Goonfleet was founded. But Goonfleet was fueled by this dislike, and began to see itself as fighting against the established order. Its leadership decided to actually buy advertisement on the Something Awful forums to attract new recruits. Goonfleet's ranks soared and eventually reached the 1,300 players, the population cap for a corporation, in EVE Online in 2005. By contrast, Band of Brothers was the most powerful organization in the game at the time, and had about 1,000 players. This isn't to say that Goonfleet could have put a fight against Band of Brothers back then, but the Goons were still largely teaching their brand new pilots how to fly their ships, and trying to figure out exactly what to do with this absurdly large mob of people. Despite Band of Brothers' disdain for the Goons, when the massive Goon fleet began to take shape, many leaders of EVE Online's biggest empires took a liking to them. Goonfleet was a fun-loving and interesting group compared to the very serious alliances that populated Nullsec, but Goonfleet's reputation among the other major groups of the era began to erode. The most notable moment came when Goonfleet's leader, Remedial, had been seen explicitly mocking the real-world death of a Band of Brothers member. This attracted the ire of Band of Brothers' leadership. This event would come back to haunt Goonfleet later as it continued to be a source of anger between the two. By now, Goonfleet had taken up residence in the region of Syndicate. Syndicate is ruled by a fictional in-game pirate faction. The region can't be conquered by player groups. But the Goons base their operation here. Syndicate was the crib of Goonkind. The Goons would say that this was where the little bees learned to fly. With constant training, Goonfleet soon became a proper corporation, and its leaders wanted to take territory of their own in Nullsec. Goonfleet's numbers had grown past the maximum limit for a single corporation, so the Goons started multiple new corporations under the alliance banner Goonswarm. Whereas most alliances were conglomerates of corporations from many different groups of players, the Goonswarm was an alliance all to itself. With starry eyes, Goonswarm invaded the Nullsec region nearest to Syndicate, and found itself fighting NORAD, veterans of the Great Northern War, in Cloudring. The invasion went quite well for Goonswarm. This was a minor event in the grand scheme of Nullsec drama, so details are scarce. But the first battles were reportedly won by Goonswarm. The Goons taunted NORAD and called them a waning power that could no longer hold its own territory. The leader of Goonswarm, Remedial, made a private offer to the CEO of NORAD: surrender this space, and we'll give you 72 hours to evacuate your assets. However, Goon spies under the direction of their intelligence officer, the Mittani, discovered that the NORAD CEO never delivered the terms of surrender to the rest of the alliance. Goon leader Remedial deemed that this was a failure of leadership and decided to publicly announce the terms of surrender on the EVE forums for all NORAD members to see. It didn't go over the way he hoped. Other leaders in the world of EVE saw the surrender conditions as premature and arrogant. The surrender conditions were still rejected. The war continued, and it hurt the reputation of the Goonswarm in the eyes of other leaders. It was at this time that a member of Goon Swarm posted a crude, stick-figure comic online depicting the death of the Band of Brothers player that Remedial was caught mocking and poking fun at Band of Brothers' outrage. The player named Vincent Van Wert, or Smoske in-game, played EVE Online with his father, who was still a member of Band of Brothers. The drawing was posted on somethingawful.com, but eventually leaked to the rest of the EVE community. Band of Brothers was furious at the continued lack of respect shown for one of their own. Still today, Band of Brothers leaders recall this as a time that they let their emotions get the better of them. They declare their intent to move north to Cloud Ring and aid the embattled NORAD and put an end to Goon Swarm's nascent nullsec ambitions. NORAD itself also banded together with Northern allies as part of a new Northern military coalition called Dusk and Dawn. The other major power nearby, Ascended Frontier, located in the south, wasn't willing to risk angering Band of Brothers and aligned itself against the Goons as well. It was called Operation Goonicide. After a month of battling, Goon Swarm was putting up a good fight in its attempt to take Cloud Ring from the newly formed Dusk and Dawn alliance, which would eventually form the military backbone of the Northern Coalition. But its opposition was too strong. The Goons had even managed to become the temporary owners of the capital system in the region, XZH TAC 4X. But Dusk and Dawn regroup took it back and began sweeping Goon Swarm from the region. There were huge losses on both sides. Over 2,000 ships were reportedly destroyed in the war for Cloud Ring, but Dusk and Dawn Alliance had held fast. Goon Swarm sounded the retreat and evacuated its assets back into Syndicate. However, the furious Band of Brothers fleet was now on its way to Syndicate, and it was about to drop the full might of its established war machine on the in-battle Goon Swarm. The Goons had just lost a month-long campaign for Cloud Ring and now would have to fight a war in their own territory against an even more powerful adversary. As he so often did, Sir Molly took the EVE Online forums to announce its campaign against Goon Swarm in one of the most famous posts ever. I quote, "There is no goons. There are no goons," he wrote. "This is as personal as it will ever get. Goodbye." What happened next could barely be called a battle. Band of Brothers arrive at the Goons' home in Syndicate in vastly better ships and with a veteran's command of the game. It steamrolled Goon Swarm and set up blockade all around its station in the region. Band of Brothers wasn't preventing the Goons from entering the stations. It was preventing them from leaving. For an entire week, Band of Brothers organized around-the-clock blockades to ensure no Goon could fly. The Goons, for their part, mostly wanted to wait out Band of Brothers to see if its pilots would get bored enough to leave. They made a hobby out of flying the cheapest ships in the games right into the waiting arms of Band of Brothers' blockade. Band of Brothers left the Goons' home after flexing for a week. Sir Molly couldn't eradicate the Goon Swarm entirely, but he'd made his point. Not everyone believes that Band of Brothers came to Syndicate just to get revenge for a despicable joke made by a Goon. I quote, "As soon as we demonstrated that we were a threat to the established order, Band of Brothers dropped what they were doing, concocted an excuse, and said that they were terrible people and a cancer of Eve, and that we needed to be removed from the game for the good of the community," said Goon Swarm spy master Mitani in 2014. He believes firmly that Band of Brothers' leadership was feigning offense as an excuse to attack the Goons. I quote, "There was a lot of clutching of pearls and cases of the vapors," he said. Regardless of the true casus belli, Goon Swarm had been stopped cold in Cloud Ring, and now was being hit hard in its home region. Dusk and Dawn would say it won the battle that counted the most by breaking the Goons in Cloud Ring. Band of Brothers would say it delivered the final blow in a vicious 1-2 combo. But Goon Swarm would also claim victory in this conflict, because for the Goons, this was a proof of concept. The Goons were beaten and bloodied, but they showed they could go toe-to-toe with a major nullsec power, and even take their territory for a short time. They had proved that experience, skill, and technology could be trumped by sheer numbers and willpower. This was the first time Goon Swarm and Band Brothers had come to blows, but it wouldn't be the last. This small skirmish in Syndicate was the opening shot in what would become EVE Online's most historic rivalry, and which would one day come to shake the face of the game. But before the Goons could hope to challenge the strongest powers of nullsec, they needed to form their alliances. They examined their options for political partnerships and reached out to one of the group in the game who seemed to have everything the Goons could want in an ally. The Russians. Chapter 12. Unholy Goonian. In June 2006, three men sat at a bar in a dimly lit Irish pub called Fado's. The pub was on a busy street in Washington, D.C., but it had an old soul. There was black stone walls and a fireplace with a black cauldron. Not that you'd light a fireplace in a humid D.C. summer. One of the men was a young D.C. corporate defense lawyer. The second was a computer specialist who worked in an information security for a company that prints Bibles. The third was an IT expert for the U.S. State Department who was between missions to far-flung U.S. embassies. You wouldn't know it judging from the volume of alcohol they were consuming, but this was a diplomatic meeting. They were waiting for a Russian-born construction worker from Brooklyn who represented the struggling yet powerful Russian Spaceship Union Red Alliance. His name was Mikhail Romachenko, but everyone in EVE knew him by his character's name, UAX Death. Death, for short. The three men of the bar were the leaders of the Goon Swarm Intelligence Agency, Alexander Giatanko, Sean Conover, and Sean Smith. They're better known by their names in EVE Online, Demetani, Darius Johnson, and Vile Rat. They met up in this Washington, D.C. bar because they'd been asked by Remedial, the leader of Goon Swarm, to size up a potential ally. They negotiated with Death many times in EVE. But the trio had been spying and hunting spies for so long, they no longer trusted anyone through a computer screen. This was a deal that needed to be sealed with a handshake. Death walked into the pub, he shook hands with the three men, and the deal was done. They ordered another round. There wasn't any negotiation. The terms of the deal had already been laid out and were well understood by this point. Vile Rat in particular had been in touch with the Russians for weeks to structure the agreement, and the Goons' leader, Remedial, had already signed off on the proposal. Vile Rat had brokered a deal that had enormous potential for both the Goons and the Russians, and the terms were simple. The Goons and the Russians would fight as one. The handshake was the final part of the deal. Both parties needed to prove to each other that they had the conviction to give their word in person, face to face. Resurgence. After being crushed by the Coalition of the South in early April 2006, Red Alliance leaders understood that they couldn't go it alone anymore and still hoped to be a power in nullsec. Their tenacity would only take them so far. The Russian community was largely reviled by much of the player base of EVE. In retrospect, much of it seems to have been basic xenophobia. Certainly, the Russians had been demonized by the Americans and the Europeans as the Coalition of the South. As Russians, their diplomatic options were limited simply because of the stigma that was attached to the Russian identity in this era of the game. Russian players were frequently stereotyped, accused of cheating, or of having mafia connections. It's likely impossible to prove if Russian players cheated at a higher frequency than people of other nationalities, but personally I find it difficult to believe. So when Red Alliance leaders Maktep and Death went searching for allies, they looked for someone who was just as hated as the Russians. They wanted to form a coalition of pariahs. They found Goon Swarm. The Goons had just been crushed in their home region of Syndicate by Band of Brothers, and they were looking for a new strategy. They were hated by fucking everybody, Death said to me in 2014. Goons were so hated, he said. We talked and figured we had a lot of mutual goals. Goons had nothing to lose because Band of Brothers kicked them up so bad. End quote. Goon Swarm couldn't have asked for someone better to take control of these negotiations. Sean Smith, aka Vile Rat, had spent much of his career in close proximity to some of the best diplomats in the world, working in places like Baghdad and Pretoria. In a matter of weeks, Death and Vile Rat had brokered a deal. The more they talked, the more they began to understand how perfect the Union actually was. The Russians of Red Alliance were few in numbers, but they were passionate and highly skilled. They were grizzled old veterans who knew the game inside and out. Goon Swarm was the opposite. It had an incredible number of pilots, but they flew in cheap ships and had little in the way of game knowledge. Swarm would have been the underdog that everyone rooted for if it wasn't intentionally uncouth. Beyond being complementary assets in battle, they were also from opposite sides of the globe. The primarily American goons matched well with the entirely Russian Red Alliance because they could cover each other's back during their respective off hours. While the goons slept, the Russians were wide awake, and vice versa. Both organizations would still be independent, but they agreed to work together towards the same long-term goals. In the following note, Goon Swarms the Mittani laid out his own reasons for agreeing for the union with Red Alliance and message to the Goons. Chronologically, this took place before the events of the previous chapter, the Ascendant Frontier War. I quote, "The way I see it, there are 5 superpowers in Eve. If we're to withstand the fact that most of the galaxy hates us, we need to buddy up with one of them. Not necessarily be slaves or whatnot, but work closely with one of them as long as term partners versus the rest of the galaxy. Our options: Band of Brothers, lol, he writes. Number 2, Dusk and Dawn. Lose too many dreadnoughts, not really so tough after all. Ascendant Frontier. They only want to make money, no strategic initiative, and they sold us out to BOB. 4, the Southern Coalition, or LV. They sold us out. They can't beat the Russians with a 6,000 to 800 ratio. Red Alliance. They have fought for 3 years against approximately 10,000 hostiles and survived and also prospered. Have no allies at all, and are accused of everything we goons are accused of. What really scares me about the Reds is that they don't follow the normal rules of alliances. Usually, if you defeat an alliance, they shatter. The Reds have lost all their territory and still come back with disciplined, vicious, and effective assault against innumerable foes. They've been in this non-stop combat for almost 3 years now. It's just insane. Endgame, I see goons as a superpower. We'll be one of that group. And we're throwing down in the final battle to divvy up the spoils of the universe. We'll either be allied with the Reds and wreaking havoc, or we'll have allied with one of the other superpowers, and we'll have to be fighting against the Reds. And while I see us beating all of the other superpowers, I do not see us beating the Reds. So we'll have to ally with them. The Mittani, Goon Swarm Spy Master, September 8, 2006. This was a prophetic, groundbreaking moment in the history of New Eden. Since the fall of the Cursed Alliance, the Russians hadn't been too keen on using diplomacy to achieve their goals. The infighting and civil wars of the fall of Curse had seemingly left them unwilling to trust outsiders. But now, they were using the olive branch as well as the laser cannon. After the invasion by the Coalition of the South, detailed in the opening chapter of this book, Red Alliance was left with no choice but to seek out allies. The Goons had a lot of trust issues to get over as well. For the past year, the Coalition of the South had been spouting anti-Russian propaganda to hurt the reputation of their enemies and feed negative stereotypes around the Russian nationality. It had work, and some people within the ranks of the Goon Swarm were hesitant to ally with people they'd come to see as untrustworthy cheaters. That the two sides didn't share language also didn't help. I quote, "It was like speaking to angry aliens from the planet of murder or something," the Medali told a journalist from the website Shack News in 2007 after about two of the Russian leaders, Maktep and Nick. You see, Russian is an extremely unusual language to listen to if you're not used to it. Maktep has a very deep voice and sounds like a gangster. He would speak in a bunch of Russian, and his lieutenant and translator Nick would speak for him. It took a master diplomat to cross these divides, and luckily the goons had one. Vilerat, one of the goons sitting at the bar in the Irish pub. He was a busy man in those days. Most people would play Eve, engage in a variety of activities like mining, fighting, exploring, and tooling around in spaceships with friends. For Vilerat, Eve was only ever about espionage and diplomacy. He wasn't just investigating Red Alliance as possible allies. He was investigating just about everyone who might sign a treaty with the Goons. That included Red Alliance's blood enemies, Lotka Volterra. Vilerat owned many characters in EVE Online. Like a man with many passports, he used these alternate characters to infiltrate and hide himself within the ranks of Lotka Volterra, assessing its wealth, its territory, and its military preparedness. When Lotka Volterra spearheaded the coalition of the South attack on Red Alliance of the siege of Sea-Tac J6, Vilerat was there. He would later recall that day as one that helped convince him that the Russians were the future of Goon Swarm. He watched Lotka Volterra fail to crush a past that was 1/10 of its size. I quote, "On one hand, you had a group that had all the power in the world, but just not enough willpower to enforce their will upon their enemies," Vilerat told Shack News in 2007. On the other side, you had a group that had little power left at all, but enough drive to take on the universe alone. It was to be a union of thousands of players, including some of the most devious spy masters and ruthless tacticians the game had ever seen. They still maintain a self-image of the bullied nerds. 8 years later, the goons still echo these sentiments, and they remember Band of Brothers as the bullies. Darius Johnson described Band of Brothers to me as jocks who bragged about their fighting skills and their beautiful girlfriends. It was a stereotype that was just as unfair as any stereotype, but it came to represent Band of Brothers in the eyes of many goons after one of Band of Brothers' member alluded to being a kickboxer with an actor with a very hot sexual partner. It's very hard to imagine the kickboxing jocks label being an entirely accurate assessment, but as with so many things in EVE Online, its veracity isn't as important as its impact. Red Swarm Federation. Just 3 weeks after their epic stand at the siege of Sea-Tac J, the Russians and Red Alliance now had a new hope: Red Swarm. The Russians only controlled between 6 and 10 systems in the heart of In's mother. With the goons now by its side, Red Alliance planned to reconquer the whole of the southeast. Goon Swarm wanted to move past its defeat in Syndicate and take its place as one of the major powers in Nullsec. Though he wasn't able to be there at the bar for the meeting, Remedial announced a plan in one of the first State of the Goonion addresses. I quote, "I ask now that we accept Syndicate not as our true home in the universe, but as our shared memory. A flicker of light in Eve's darkness and isolation. I ask not that we throw it aside or toss it into the trash like so much crumpled paper, but that we lay it to rest with honor like a retired flag. Syndicate will always be ours in spirit, for it once stood for our dreams of unity and hope for the future. But all good things must come to an end. As we once lived amongst the stars of JQV 5 TAC 9 and called it our home, that chapter of our history has come to an end. The first volume has been written, and I lay it on the altar of the Brotherhood of Goons for all to judge. I ask for a moment of silence now for our sacrifices here and for Syndicate, our first homeland. It is time to begin a new chapter in our lives. This tale will be one of conquest, of strife and exaltation, of seemingly insurmountable challenges and impossible victories. Captured from the jaws of those who once hunted us for sport, it is our turn to write the future of the South, and we will go not to hunt our enemies for sport, but to extinguish them forever. We will approach this new adventure as Goonswarm always has, by biting off more than anybody else could chew and surpassing all expectations. We will invade the South, take their outpost, build our own, and lay waste to all who oppose us. Remedial, CEO of Goonswarm, September 28, 2006. The Coalition was still trying to figure out how to deal with Red Alliance following its resurgence in the southeast after the siege of SeaTac-J. And now it would have to contend with the formidable manpower of Goonswarm. The Coalition believed that the best way to prevent this situation from getting out of control was to prevent Goonswarm and Red Alliance from uniting their fleets. The Coalition moved its pilots to the key systems that connected the eastern Nullsec territories to Empire space, hoping to blockade the area and prevent the Goons from reaching the Russians with their reinforcements and supplies. The move ultimately failed, and the Goons were able to run the blockade and unite with Red Alliance. The arrival of the Goons marked a new stage of the war against the Coalition of the South. It was like a slow-motion domino effect. The Coalition of the South began in early 2006 as a unification of Lotka Volterra, Knights of the Southern Cross, Chimera Pact, and Veritas Immortalis. While Lotka and Veritas were focused on cutting off the Goons' route into the southeast, Chimera Pact guarded the rear in Imensia and Detorid. The Knights focused its defense on a single system in Innsmother, N7-TAC-BIY. There are three systems that truly matter in Innsmother: SeaTac-J, 6MT, F2A TAC-JX, and N7-TAC-BIY. After the Coalition lost the siege of SeaTac-J, it also evacuated F2A, which is just 4 jumps away. But in N7-TAC, the Coalition of the South battened down the hatches and got ready to defend against the Red Swarm advance. With 20 star bases anchored in the system, the battle planners and the Knights thought they could defend. They were wrong. The Red Alliance Goonswarm fleet that assaulted the system outnumbered the defenders 6-1 and overran the stronghold. The Knights begged the Coalition of the South High Command to commit its most valuable capital ships, dreadnoughts, to the defense of the system. But the request was denied. The Coalition of the South leaders declared N7-TAC in the entire region of Innsmother a lost cause. Knights of the Southern Cross hastily began evacuating everything it could from N7-TAC, sneaking by in the hours when Red Swarm forces weren't as active. It managed to get about 70% of its asset out, but was forced to leave behind all of its star bases, an important loss for the Coalition. The Knights regrouped in the nearest major system and prepared its new line of defense. Its members were outraged that their allies in the Coalition of the South did not come to their aid. About half of its personnel decided that they had enough of this toxic situation and left the alliance. Naturally, this created distance in the relationship between Knights of the Southern Cross and the larger Coalition. Abandoned by its allies, Knights of the Southern Cross became increasingly bitter. Constant argument erupted between the Alliance's leaders and the other leaders in the Coalition of the South. Eventually, fighting broke out, and the Knights' ships were engaged in combat with other ships from the Coalition of the South. In the aftermath, the Knights of the Southern Cross not only renounced its alliance with the Coalition of the South, but formally allied itself with Red Swarm Federation. To make matters worse, Veritas Immortalis was now dealing with its own local war to the north in the Great Wildlands. By November 2006, The coalition of the South was falling apart. The showdown in the southeast was now coming to a head between the last major power, Volterra, and Red Swarm Federation. Red Swarm Federation worked hard to consolidate power in the south and east. It found many new allies, and it convinced smaller alliances that the old guard of the south was dead. The new face of EVE Online, it boasted, was Red Swarm Federation. These smaller alliances signed up in droves to get in on the ground floor of a brand new power in EVE Online. Joining Red Alliance, Goon Swarm, and Toseti Federation were Interstellar Alcohol Conglomerate, United Legion, Smash Alliance, Roadkill, and Quartet. None was particularly powerful on its own, but together they became an imposing force. The 70 Russians that held off the siege of SeaTac J were now among the leaders of a coalition that represented as many as 15,000 players. But Volterra was still very wealthy, and it had focused all of its attention on defending against an armada at its doorstep. Volterra was an alliance that defied easy description. It didn't have the elite combat pilots of Band of Brothers or the master builders of Ascended Frontier, but was someplace in between. Volterra was considered an industrial power, but was also at the head of a coalition that had swept Red Alliance off the map 2 months earlier. It seems from a historical vantage point that Volterra's talent was for diplomacy. It had managed to secure itself a fortress in the deep south completely surrounded by allies. Volterra built the coalition of the south, and it was also previously allied with the Ascended Frontier and well liked by Band of Brothers. The battle for Scalding Pass. By late November 2006, the war against Knights of the Southern Cross had ended. Red Swarm Federation had effectively driven Wedge straight through the middle of the coalition of the South and could now aid insurgents in nearby Scalding Pass in taking down Veritas Immortalis, a staunch ally of Volterra and one of the few remaining members of the coalition of the South. Red Swarm managed to gain its first foothold in the Scalding Pass region thanks to a negligent mistake by Veritas. With the war raging, Veritas had agreed to allow an ally named Opus to take management and maintenance of the valuable system in GLO Taxi 3. The system contained a refinery and was one of the gateway system into Scalding Pass from Red Swarm held territory. In order to give Opus control, Veritas needed to move its star bases out of the system, and Opus needed to move in its own. Veritas Immortalis began shutting down its star bases and moving out of the system, but they never bothered to check to see if Opus's directors were online and ready to move in their own star bases. Without any active star bases anchored, the system had no owner, and Red Swarm caught wind of the mistake. Within hours, it gathered a fleet of hundreds of pilots, shut down the system, and set up blockades around every Stargate starbase and started anchoring its own starbases. Within a very short time, Red Swarm had seized control of a foothold in Scalding Pass. But it was only a foothold. The real target was 1 VTAC L1 LI2, the heart of the region and the headquarters of Veritas Immortalis. On December 8, 2006, Red Swarm Federation rallied its fleet and made a move to hit 1 VTAC. If it is successful, the offensive would close out the northern front of the war and deal a devastating blow to the coalition of the South. Veritas Immortalis and Volterra knew it was a crucial system, and they were committed to defending it. The newly acquired stronghold in JLO, just a few systems to the north, Red Swarm Federation moved in with a fleet of 200 battleships and dozens of capital ships and besieged the defenses of Veritas Immortalis. The Armada moved as one unit from starbase to starbase, enforcing its will upon the home system of its arch-rivals. The Red Swarm ships blasted the infrastructures of the system unopposed until a small enemy probe frigate appeared in the middle of their fleet. It was shot down almost immediately, but not before it could deploy a Sino field. A Sino field looks like an electric ball coursing with pink light, and it is used as a navigation point for capital ships and sub-capitals teleported from a Titan many system away. The Red Swarm fleet commander assumed Veritas was getting ready to warp in its forces for a major engagement. It gathered up and prepared for a huge fight. Suddenly, white light engulfed the monitors of 300 Red Swarm pilots, then darkness, then a logon screen. The EVE Online server crashed. In a frenzy, all 300 rushed to log back into the game as quickly as possible, and one by one they discovered why the server had crashed. The wreckage of 217 Red Swarm Federation ships littered the system. The Sino field had been used to remotely detonate the doomsday weapon of a Titan. Red Swarm Federation had not prepared for this possibility because its leaders had no idea Lutka Volterra possessed a Titan in the first place. The valuable warship had been built in secrecy in the heart of Lutka Volterra space. Nearly every Red Swarm battleship had been brought to 1v TAC was now a wreck. And worse, the more durable capital ships were now completely exposed with no support fleet. But the fight wasn't over. Red Swarm's carrier fleet rushed into the system carrying an armada of reinforcements. Groen Swarm's own leader, Remedial, flew one of them and doled out new ships to the eager Red Swarm pilots. Within minutes, the entire Red Swarm fleet was replaced and the fight was back on. Red Swarm was unstoppable, the most devastating blast in the history of EVE Online by a multiple of 10 had only served to momentarily stop the advance of the Red Swarm Federation. With its fleet ready for battle once again, Red Swarm continued its siege on Veritas' defenses and overwhelmed the system. Lutka Volterra's Titan was able to retreat, but the capital system of Veritas Immortalis fell into the hands of Red Swarm. Groen Swarm wasn't just showing off the power of its swarm tactics. It was showing off the discipline of its pilots and the strategic mastery of its fleet commanders. It was the fleet commanders who had the foresight to stockpile an entire second fleet's worth of ships, and the dutiful coordination of the Groen pilots to get reshipped and back in the fight in a matter of minutes. Veritas fell into a failure cascade after the loss of its headquarters at 1v TAC. Even after causing the most destructive single moment in the history of EVE Online so far, it had lost a battle, and its morale was broken. It continued to defend Scalding Pass and the Great Wildlands to the new year, but by mid-January, Veritas Immortalis was erased from the map. The Great War looms. This war against Veritas gave Lutka about 2 months to reinforce its home territories, and it used that time well. It was January 2007 now, and Lutka Volterra had built up its capital fleet. The Titan it had unveiled at the Battle of 1v TAC was its great hope. It was the flagship around which the Alliance would rally in the defense of Lutka Volterra's sovereign territory. Armed with a Titan, Lutka was a formidable fighting force, but diplomacy was its strength, and its leaders were lobbying for support from a powerful new ally, Band of Brothers. Lutka and BOB's leaders were on friendly terms, and the fact that Band of Brothers hated both Groen Swarm and Red Alliance made it highly interested in supporting Lutka. Lutka Volterra was going to need Sir Baldy's help to win the coming war. Chapter 13. The Great Eve War begins. The New Eden star cluster was now more or less evenly divided into 3 main power blocks, Band of Brothers and Lutka Volterra in the south and west, Red Swarm Federation in the southeast, and the Northern Coalition in the north. This triumvirate might have brought some stability to the game, but the politics were too messy. There were bad bloods to spare, and many scores left to settle. New Eden was once again a powder keg and the fuse was about to be lit. The Intelligence War. As Lutka Volterra and the Red Swarm prepared for an epic confrontation, one rogue agent contacted the Mittani of Goon Swarm to offer his services as an intelligence agent. He was no ordinary agent. He was a real-life hacker, and he was selling his unique services to the highest bidder. The hacker went by the name Kugootsman, and he offered to break into Lutka's out-of-game forums and emails to expose its plans and weaknesses. The Mittani declined the offer. He already had access to a sleeper agent, a high-ranking official who had secretly defected to Goon Swarm, who provided all of the intel he needed on Lutka Volterra. A few days later, the Mittani's sleeper agent sent an urgent message. Private Goon Swarm communication were being discussed by other Lutka Volterra's leaders. There was a leak at the highest level of Goon Swarm. I quote, "It began with emergency private director meetings, because at first we had no idea if the leak was evidence of a traitor or something worse," wrote the Mittani. "After a frantic phone call to our server admin, we determined the truth. We had been hacked." After being turned down by Goon Swarm, the Kugootsman had approached Lalante, a high-ranking fleet commander in Latka, and made him the same offer he made the Mittani. Lalante accepted and agreed to pay him a huge sum of 500 million ISK per week for access to the Goon Swarm director forums. Kugootsman even got him into the account of Remedial, Goon Swarm's leader. Kugootsman wasn't finished though. The Mittani spies and a band of brothers ally called Xelis Alliance told him that the Mittani's emails were showing up in Xelis Alliance's forums. Turned out that Kugootsman had also approached Xelis, and as a demonstration of his abilities, he had given them screenshots of the Mittani's email discussion with his spy inside Xelis Alliance. I quote, "We discovered in the fury of research in the aftermath of the hacking that Kugootsman was the real thing," wrote the Mittani in retrospect. Still quoting, "While a teenager in France, he had been convicted of defrauding the FBI of $250,000 and had since fled to Jakarta, Indonesia, a place where the anti-hacking laws are so hilariously lax that it has become an international center for the computer security industry. The man was a security professional with a penchant for setting up swanky nightclubs in his spare time. And we had no legal recourse whatsoever," he said. End quote. What happened next surprised even the Mittani. Kugootsman contacted the Mittani again and told him everything he'd done. He told the Mittani that when his hack into the Goon Swarm forums was discovered and shut down, Lalante refused to pay him for the service. Now all he wanted was revenge against his deadbeat client, so he was willing to dig into Goon Swarm's enemies for free. I quote, "The act of hubris may come to be known as one of the most foolish and self-destructive decisions made in the game, because Kugootsman promptly outed Lalante to me and began actively working against Lutka and its allies." End quote. Now seeking revenge against Lutka Volterra, Kugootsman turned his eye towards its allies as well, namely Band of Brothers. There we go. As he hacked into Band of Brothers' private accounts, he scanned through its members' communication until he found something that would change the face of EVE Online forever. The T20 scandal. February of 2007 is one of the most rare moments in the history of EVE where the true version of events is likely lost to history. The drama was so chaotic and politically charged that even 7 years later it's hard to know whom to trust to tell the definitive version of the tale, if anyone can. On January 30, 2007, Kugootsman published the first part of a series called Reikoku Makes Its Own Luck. Reikoku was a key member of Band of Brothers. Throughout 6 installments, Kugootsman showed off alleged private messages and communication from high-ranking Band of Brothers directors, engaging in illegal actions like account sharing. several players sharing the use of high-value in-game characters, which violated CCP Games' terms of service. Most of them were relatively mundane accusations. Most high-level player groups shared characters, by the way, but a couple stuck out as highly scandalous. The most shocking accusation was that Band of Brothers had in its ranks an employee of the game's developer, CCP Games. It was common for developers to join high-level corporations, but their true identity was supposed to remain a closely guarded secret. Both players in CCP Games saw value in developers playing secretly alongside everyday players because that would ensure the developers understood what the game was like for the average EVE pilot. The developers would share all of the average player's complaints and ideally would be more effective in improving the game. As long as nobody knew the developer's true identity, then the practice was considered mostly harmless. If their identity was known, however, Alliance leaders might be tempted to ask for favors or come up with schemes to use the developer's power to secure their alliance an advantage. The developer would have the power to spawn new items into the game that shouldn't exist or to give information on enemy alliances that players shouldn't have access to. Even little things like being able to use a developer to fix in-game bugs and glitches faster than other alliances was considered to be an unfair advantage. This situation was significant because the evidence suggested Band of Brothers directors knew who this developer really was. Band of Brothers denied everything. I quote, "Play the game on a high level. We have a high profile. This isn't the first accusation of cheating or hacking and God knows what else that has been flung at us. The tinfoil hattery is amazing. I know that you would love for us all to be framed for some conspiracy. Since we're all still here, all the accusations are totally baseless. There will be developers in every alliance in the game, and I, for one, do not want to know who is a developer or not. I want them to be in the middle of everything, from low-level gaming to high-level gaming, so that they see the issues we all face, from day to day. Face it, you love the drama and the conspiracy theories, and that's all there is, drama and conspiracy theories." End quote. One of the posts by the hacker Kagootsman identified the CCP developer by the name of CCP T20 as a high-level member within Band of Brothers. Worse, the post alleged that he had illegitimately used his developer powers to spawn items in the game which could create wealth for his alliance. After an internal investigation, CCP Games determined that this particular accusation was true, and the company decided that the best way to deal with the situation was to come clean and resolve the situation publicly. T20 himself, whose real name was never revealed to the public, was made to write a post on CCP's website apologizing for the impropriety. I quote, "Regrettably, my actions inevitably led to a shadow of suspicions being cast on a number of my co-workers, as well as Rikoku and Band of Brothers." Read the confession in part. So quoting, "I wish to make it clear that I acted alone and my co-workers and Corp Alliance mates have been cleared of any alleged wrongdoing. As much as this is a confession, it is also a request for your forgiveness for events of which I'm truly sorry." The T20 scandal sparked the most intense controversy and outrage that either EVE or CCP had experienced. Players across the games were incensed, and the conventional wisdom spread that Band of Brothers was the pet alliance of CCP Games. This, many players thought, was the perfect explanation for Bob's success over the past 4 years. Almost all of EVE Online now believed Band of Brothers to be cheaters, and this triggered a grassroots movement to drive it out of nullsec altogether. The anger against Band of Brothers was real, and the fire was stoked by its enemies in nullsec. Bob the Conquerors became Bob the Cheaters. To stand against Band of Brothers became a social proxy for opposing developer overreach in favor of fairness. The community was enraged, and the anger united players who ordinarily would have been enemies. In true EVE fashion, The anti-Band of Brothers message became co-opted by rival leaders to serve their own ends as well. I quote, "The Mitanni, as much as hubris just drips from his every pore, knew politics." Dianabolic, one of the highest-ranking leaders of Band of Brothers, recalled in an interview, so quoting, "He knew propaganda. He was excellent at it. Without guys like him, the controversy would have petered out? Not sure." Band of Brothers' own coalition held fast, though. Not everyone believed that the revelation of developer impropriety were worth a holy war, and so the greater Band of Brothers community maintained a healthy roster of allies. This event also brought Red Swarm and the Northern Coalition into an alliance of convenience. They were so far apart geographically that they didn't have to like each other. They just had to mutually agree that band of developers was too much of threat to be allowed to survive. The T20 incident was the spark that set off this explosion. But Band of Brothers itself had created a condition that allowed this type of mega coalition of enemies to come together against it. Band of Brothers was constantly antagonistic. It fought against everybody and schemed to counter every star system possible. Sir Molly had created a political climate in Nullsec where Band of Brothers was feared and hated across New Eden. This was manageable when his enemies acted alone, because Band of Brothers could mop the floor with any single adversary. But the T20 malfeasance was a crystallizing moment that brought all of Band of Brothers' enemies together. The adversaries of Band of Brothers knew that at this moment they had the political momentum to unite in a grand coalition to destroy Band of Brothers forever. Nothing else mattered more than destroying Sir Molly's empire. The stage was set for what we now know as the Great War. The Great War. This is where most people will tell you that Eve's Great War began. But the true beginning of the war could be charted back to the dissolution of the Curse Alliance in 2004, or to the formation of the Coalition of the South to drive Red Alliance out of Nullsec in 2005. This was a war that had been smoldering for years, and now had become a raging inferno that had the potential to bring every region of the game into a single massive war. Band of Brothers was the largest empire that the game had ever known. Red Swarm Federation was on the rise, but lacked the firepower of the larger alliances. Lotka Volterra had demonstrated enormously effective use of its Titan's Doomsday weapon. The Northern Coalition was an untested force when it came to warfare on this scale. Nobody knew what would happen when these titanic forces collided, but everyone knew that the resulting conflict would shape the face of the game for years to come. The war was inevitable, and every alliance was trying to put itself in the best position possible once the situation spiraled out of control. Red Swarm decided that a quick attack was the best way to throw off the nascent Band of Brothers Lotka Volterra's coalition. Groen Swarms, the Mitanni, described his alliance's decision to invade Lotka despite the risk of it spiraling into a massive conflict in the following blog post. I tend to think in terms of worst-case scenarios. When we discussed the war, Remedial sold me on it with this simple logic. What is the worst current possible scenario we as an alliance could face? The answer is a combined Band of Brothers and Lotka strike. Band of Brothers attack us, it is absolutely 100% certain that LV will bandwagon with them to wreck us and our allies. By contrast, if we attack Lotka Volterra, it is not 100% certain that Band of Brothers will suddenly come to save their bacon. Is it a possibility? Yes. But it is far from certain that Band of Brothers will intervene, while by contrast it is absolutely certain that Lotka Volterra would bandwagon against us, should Band of Brothers hit us first. This war is not about territory. It is about annihilating a threat to us, breaking their will and their morale and their conceptions of themselves to the point that they cease to be a strategic threat to us. Be aware of the risk that Band of Brothers will attack us in the middle of Lotka Volterra campaign, but already Lutka Volterra pilots are showing strain from all of the other anti-coalition campaigns. And I stand by the argument that it is better for us to go on the offensive and cut down Lutka presents to us as much as possible before Banner Brothers intervenes, or could intervene. The Mittani, Goonswarm Master, Red Swarm Federation on a date unknown. And so the invasion of Lutka Volterra began. On January 22nd, 2007, Red Swarm Federation began its assault on Lutka Volterra's sovereign territory. Red Swarm had already rolled over every other faction of the coalition of the South and was extremely confident going into what it viewed as the final stage of the war. Red Swarm assembled an impressive 300-strong fleet and made its way toward Detorid, the northernmost tip of Lutka Volterra's empire. This didn't come as a surprise to the leaders of Lutka Volterra, who knew very well that the enemy fleet was on the way. Lutka Volterra formed a strong defense in the choke point system of 4NDT TAC W, the logical Red Swarm attack point. All entry points into the system were sealed off, and Lutka even took the risk of fielding its Titan, piloted by an alliance leader named Chow down. Red Swarm had no hope of succeeding with a frontal assault. In response, Red Swarm split its forces and sent a flanking fleet 25 jumps out of its way, a detour of more than an hour, in order to attack the systems from multiple entry points. When the forces finally arrived, they coordinated their attack on the system like a SWAT team, busting down the front and the back door simultaneously. Once inside the system, the Red Swarm flanking fleet ran headlong into the bulk of Lutka defense force. Just as quickly as the flanking fleet had arrived, it turned around and scampered off far into deep space to regroup and plan the fight. Meanwhile, Sesfan Claw, Goonswarm's top fleet commander, took the bulk of Red Swarm fleet and mounted an attack on the main Lutka fleet. Kula pilots worked into as close as possible to chow down's Titan flagship and fire their cannons. Though initially Red Swarm took a beating from the Titan's Doomsday cannon, it slowly began to gain an edge, and Lutka fleet numbers were dwindling. Without an adequate support fleet, Chow down's Titan was forced to withdraw as well. With a growing battlefield advantage, Red Swarm felt comfortable bringing in its Dreadnought fleet to start beating down Lutka starbase infrastructure in the system. Red Swarm Dreadnoughts managed to take down several Lutka Volterra starbases that night and replace them with their own, before they were forced to retreat for the evening. The next night, Lutka Volterra's pilots showed up with its own capital ship fleet and besieged the Red Swarm starbases that had been erected that night before. Lutka Volterra did enough damage to put the Red Swarm starbases into reinforced mode, and it retreated with plans to return later to finish the job. By mistake, one of the Red Swarm starbases had been loaded with the wrong amount of strontium and was now set to come out of reinforced mode during Lutka Volterra's prime time the next day. The information leaked to Lutka Volterra that Red Swarm was weak during this time, and a major attack was planned to take advantage of the opening. The information happened to be wrong. Through a mixture of coincidence and sheer dedication, a critical mass of Red Swarm pilots were able to wake up early and join the fleet before working hours in North America. Both Lutka Volterra and Red Swarm gathered their fleets and made their way to the vulnerable starbase. Red Swarm got there first, and its fleet commander, Sesfan Claw, ordered the 2/3 of the fleet to log out of the game. These forces were essentially hidden in the system. Those pilots could still receive orders from the fleet commander through external programs and voice communications, and were waiting for the signal to log in and enter the fight. Lutka Volterra arrived in the systems a short time before the starbase was scheduled to run out of strontium. When the Lutka Volterra fleet commander scouted the Red Swarm fleet, they saw exactly what they expected to see during a weak Red Swarm time zone: a relatively small defense force. The Lutka Volterra pilots had no idea they were charging headlong into a login trap. As a starbase came out of reinforced mode, Sesfon Claw gave the order for his fleet's logistics ships to warp in and begin recharging the shields on the starbase. At the same moment, Lutka Volterra's 23 dreadnoughts began unloading munitions into the starbase armor, even as it was being repaired. Then Red Swarm sprang the trap. A single Goon Swarm pilot logged in next to Lutka Volterra's capital fleet and deployed a warp disruption bubble. It looks like a giant blue bubble coursing with electricity, and it prevents any warping within it, so Lutka Volterra's couldn't retreat. At that instant, a force of 150 Red Swarm ships, a Goon Swarm support and battleship fleet, and nearly 24 Red Alliance dreadnoughts logged into the game and unloaded their weapons into the stunned Lutka Volterra fleet. It was a classic log-on trap, and Red Swarm was quick and disciplined despite its pilot's lack of sleep. Its electronics warfare ships jam exactly the right targets at exactly the right times, and its support ships kept nearly every enemy locked down and immobilized. Red Swarm had become a well-oiled machine. When the smoke cleared, the Red Swarm starbase was still standing, and 16 lifeless Lutka Volterra dreadnought hulls floated through the grim darkness of 4ND. The most dreadnoughts ever lost in a single battle. By comparison, Red Swarm lost just 2 dreadnoughts of its own in the fighting. I quote, "They had staged a particularly well-done log-on trap and destroyed almost 20 of our dreadnoughts, which just destroyed our morale," said Lalante, a high-ranking Lutka Volterra fleet commander. He goes on to say, after that, they just steamrolled system after system after system. With this, Red Swarm had both the foothold it needed in Detorid and the decisive victory needed to justify continued war against Lutka. Every alliance needs wins to build morale, and Red Swarm had proven to its pilots beyond any doubt that the war could be won. Baby Titan. Lutka Volterra's only advantage against Red Swarm was its Titan. Whatever its faults, Lutka Volterra knew how to use Titans better than anyone. Immediately after finishing its first Titan, Lutka Volterra began constructing another. Only 3 Titans existed in the game at this point, but Lutka Volterra was on its way to building its second. Even with a massive victory at its backs, Red Swarm shuddered at the prospect of having to survive 2 Doomsday Blasts in every battle. It could not afford to let that happen, and it set its sights on Lutka Volterra's capital shipyard in JVY, where the second Titan was under construction with mere weeks to go until its launch. There was no mad search for the Titan's location as had been the case when Ascendant Frontier was building Steve. Red Swarm intelligence agent had discovered exactly where it was being constructed. Having already chewed through much of Detorid, Red Swarm attacked JV1, hitting its infrastructure and putting all 4 star bases into reinforce mode on February 8th. If Red Swarm ever had any doubt that this was where the Titan was being constructed, they would put to rest when just 1 day later, Band of Brothers declared its intention to formally enter the war and commit fleets to defending Lutka Volterra's territory. It was obvious that this was not a battle Lutka Volterra could afford to lose, and it had enlisted the help of Band of Brothers to make sure JV1 did not fall. Band of Brothers brought Sir Moldy's own Titan to the war effort, and Red Swarm now had to fear that the birth of the baby Titan would mean facing 3 Doomsday Blasts in every battle. Red Swarm redoubled its efforts. Hey, thank you, Lucky Man. Red Swarm redoubled its efforts to take down the shipyard in JV1. In a surprise late-night attack, the Red Swarm pilots gathered a hold on the system, put Lutka Volterra star bases and the attached shipyard into reinforce mode, and logged off nearby. Logging off inside the system meant they would have to barge through the front door. Their ships would have already been in the systems, right near their target. Then they noticed something very strange. The starbase and the capital shipyard were set to come out of reinforce mode at 5 AM in Europe. A terrible time for Lutka. Red Swarm was confused. Was this a trap? Red Swarm still hadn't seen the full force of a Band of Brothers Lutka Volterra joint mission. Were they being lured into a false sense of calm? I quote, "Judging by the state of affairs on the Goon Fleet forums, the Directorate was expecting a massive Lutka and Band of Brothers offensive. It was quite obvious that they expected an assault on Red Swarm territory in Scalding Pass. The obvious counter to this was a spoiling attack. If your enemy is winding up for a roundhouse knockout punch, give him a quick jab to the throat and ruin his day. When the reinforcement timer was announced over TeamSpeak, speculation ran rampant. Was this a massive fuck-up on the part of Lutka Volterra, or an incredibly daring trap? Either way, TeamSpeak and the forums exploded with speculation. Sesfon Claw gives the order for the gang to say spot and log off in JV1. If the Titan is a trap, we're going to charge into it at full speed. We're expecting a massive assault on Red Swarm positions at about 2100 on 15th of February. The fact that this starbase, with an embryonic Titan in it, comes out of reinforce a mere 7 hours after this supposed offensive kickoff time, causes many to speculate that this is a capital trap on a massive scale from Lutka and Band of Brothers. However, nobody in Red Swarm can resist such tempting bait. Goon Swarm Public History. To wit, the Goon Swarm history files quote a Red Alliance's pilot's rallying cry, written in the best English he could muster, to take the risk and attack in full. I quote, "We have great forces in our Red Coalition. We know that Strong-Term Timer is not wonder. It's a fucking trap, and we take hard losses," he said, "and now we have 22 hours to think how we will survive 3 Doomsday and fuck joint capital fleet of Lutka and Band of Brothers and Baby Titan. Let's see who have better tactics and more surprises." The belated Valentine's Day Massacre. It became obvious that the war between Lutka Volterra and the Red Swarm Federation was going to be decided here in JV1, out in the dead-end rear of Tenerife. Everyone in Red Alliance, which had nearly destroyed by Lutka Volterra just 6 months earlier, was going to be there. Even interlopers who were merely friends with Red Swarm pilots, or simply hated Lutka, showed up just to be part of the destruction of the Titan. Lutka Volterra's leaders knew this too and were at a heightened state of alert. In the night, Red Swarm moved about a third of its forces to JV1 and logged off inside the system. Red Swarm now had more than 300 ships waiting to log on into the system, and as many as 600 more would be ready to charge through the Stargate when the battle began. Meanwhile, Band of Brothers had been forced to retreat to deal with multiple unrelated attacks on its territory, a critical setback for Lutka Volterra. Every Lutka Volterra player available was logged in for the Battle of JV1, and the Alliance managed to gather a fleet of 500 pilots. It was almost more than the game's servers could handle, and the lag was already spiking with just Lutka Volterra's defense fleet online. Nevertheless, the defense fleet stood guard over the only entry point to the system. 500 warships ready to incinerate the first scrap of metal unlucky enough to jump through the gate. When a force as large as Red Swarm's fleet was trying to use a single Stargate to enter the system, the Stargate functioned a little bit like how a toll booth in the real world can clog up a highway. As Red Swarm trickled through the Stargate, their fleet would momentarily divide it as some ships made it through the Stargate, but others waited in line. Lalante, the Vodka commander, was piloting the Alliance's flagship Titan and had hidden the ship in MTAC-R. Lalante knew that the majority of the Red Swarm fleet would get clogged up in MTAC-R while waiting to jump into JV1. At that point, he'd detonate his Doomsday Blast and annihilate the mass of Red Swarm pilots that were still waiting for their turn. The idea, I quote, was that we'd achieve a sort of sandwich effect, and those who were able to jump through the gate would die to the fleet, and those that couldn't would die to my doomsday, said Lalante. On February 16, Red Swarm Federation arrived in force to assault JV1 with 600 ships. As the fleet began jumping through the Stargate, Lalante moved in and fired the Titan's doomsday. Lalante waited to see the massive explosion. The screen went blank. Everything stopped, The server snapped like a twig and the whole region went offline. CCP developers were roused from bed and tried to get things working again by dedicating extra server processing power to JV1. EVE Online is a very unique single-server virtual world, so there aren't standard industry procedures for how to deal with the unique problem it faces. When EVE's players push the game to its limits, CCP Games engineers have to figure out brand new ways to accommodate them on the fly. Within minutes, the server was repaired and came back online. As it did, a massive logging queue began. What was sure to be a climactic battle between the two mightiest armies ever assembled was now a complete mess. The over 1,200 pilots at the Battle of JV1 were now standing in line waiting for permission to enter the battlefield. Their ships, meanwhile, floated lifelessly in the system as their pilots struggled to get online to pilot them. The problem was that the Red Swarm ships were higher on that logging queue because they had already been trying to log in. Consequently, Red Swarm got a fleet of hundreds of ships online in said JV1, while Lutka Volterra pilots were getting in a few at a time. I quote, "What ensued was a complete slaughter. One by one, the defenseless Lutka Volterra ships were destroyed as Red Swarm gleefully took the opportunity that was presented to them. When the Lutka defense fleet had been destroyed, Red Swarm moved into position in orbit around the shipyard with the incomplete Titan and let loose a torrent of ammunition. Within minutes, the capital shipyard that was building Lutka's second Titan, its best hope at turning back the Red Swarm advance, was gone. The Goons had a fully loaded 400 to 500 man battleship fleet and our 500 man battleship fleet. Our incredible camp. This huge, incredibly powerful fleet was logged in ones and twos because there was a server queue to log in. Eventually, after hundreds of losses and very little coordination, because none of our fleet commanders could log in, we stood down. And that was the end of Lutka Volterra. 7 years after the assault, one grunt pilot wrote down his recollection of the whole affair. I quote, "I've never seen anything like the Battle of JV1. I couldn't believe how many capital ships there were. The Stargate was littered with bubbles, comms were literally buzzing, but when the smoke and lag cleared, the system was lost. Some rearguard action took place, but the fall of JV1 brought Lutka Volterra. This battle directly led to the downfall of a 1,000-strong alliance of players. Morale for Lutka Volterra was already on the ropes, and it had lost a number of key battles. Band of Brothers hadn't been there to back Lutka Volterra up at JV1, which may have led to the loss of its in-construction second Titan. Worst of all, the Red Swarm Federation had paraded an unthinkable amount of support for its campaign. The number of pilots it had rallied to its side at JV1 was far beyond anything seen before. Militarily, Lutka Volterra had already been bested several times, and there was a moment that its morale broke. It's always difficult to get people to commit long portions of their day to fleet operations, doubly so if you're losing the war. But imagine how hard it would be to convince people to spend their Saturday following your orders if it was likely the enemy would show up with so many ships that they'd crash the server and destroy your assets while you were stuck staring at the login screen. The war went on for a couple more weeks, but it was clear that Lutka was broken, and in the process of a failure cascade. On February 20th, the Lutka Volterra starbase and an important system 77S8 TAC-E in Detroit suddenly went offline without fuel, allowing Red Swarm to swoop in, destroy them unopposed, and capture the system. Once Red Swarm pilots had the station under control, they renamed it the 77S8 Failure Cascade, as a taunt at their enemies. Lutka Volterra leadership was losing control, and important things like making sure you fuel your star bases were falling through the cracks. I quote, "Lutka Volterra morale has shattered, and it'll be all downhill from here. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a failure cascade. I repeat, we have a failure cascade. the Mittani spy master of the Goon Swarm intelligence agency Red Swarm Federation, 2007. Over the ensuing weeks, Lotka Volterra spent most of its time retreating while making half-hearted attempts to strike back at Red Swarm with smaller 75 to 100 ship fleets. But the lackluster effort wasn't nearly enough to stop the bulldozer that had pushed Lotka out of Detorid and was now taking Tenef Rifis system by system. It took time, though, as there was plenty of Lotka Volterra infrastructure that needed to be destroyed before the region officially came under Red Swarm Federation control. Reports began to emerge that Lotka Volterra was evacuating its assets from hot zones under the belief it could no longer protect them. But Red Swarm wasn't about to accept surrender. Lotka Volterra was a part of the same coalition that had tried to eradicate Red Alliance 8 months earlier. They was received no quarter. I quote again, "The Lotka Volterra leadership is basically MIA. Their ability to field fleets has been greatly reduced and their capital ships are spread out, badly supplied and lacking in coordination. Lotka CEO have ordered the evacuation of tenants from Omist, even though we haven't yet arrived there in force. Lotka Volterra corporations are beginning to tear down star bases in several of Tenerife's systems in order to save members' assets. And Red Alliance reports a huge increase in Lotka Volterra carrier activities around stations in Curse. Currently, it appears that they are in full retreat, and although they may make some stands, if we attack their remaining star bases, they have decided to give up most or all of their conquerable space in the short run. Our goals in the immediate future will be to maximize losses to Lotka Volterra Corps and members as they retreat. Fleet commanders should focus heavily on preventing Lotka Volterra from anchoring star bases in safety, as they will almost certainly run out of fuel soon without a top-down logistic infrastructure in place. Stations should be par for the course. Blockades, and we must take every action to inflict pain on fleeing care bearers and PvPers alike. Will not be offering a ceasefire. We will take every system which they do not attempt, empty of star bases by force. Your duty is to prevent Lotka Volterra from carrying their assets out of these stations before they are captured by Goon Swarm and its allies. I estimate that we will control 16 or more stations within the next 3 weeks. Remedial Goon Swarm Director, Red Swarm Federation on a date unknown." Over the next 3 weeks, Red Swarm fleet besieged every Lotka system of consequence and flew in its space with impunity. Red Swarm pushed the remnants of Lotka Volterra back through Tenerifis and out of Omist before coming back to seal the deal. The final systems still flying in Lotka Volterra Flaming Skull insignia, DG, TAC 8VJ, and Detorid was conquered by Red Swarm on March 18, 2007. It was symbolically handed over to Red Alliance as a token of its year-long struggle against the forces of the Coalition of the South. 9 months earlier, no one in their right mind would have anticipated this outcome. In May 2006, Red Alliance held just one space station with 70 pilots. Now it was at the vanguard of a coalition that numbered in tens of thousands and once again ranked as one of the strongest forces in all of the Eve. I quote, "As of today, every system in former LV space has been taken," wrote the Mittani. This includes, tongue twister come in, 9 TAC 980U, JV1V TAC O, XGH TAC SH, GTAC D0N3, Tenerifis, 77S8 TAC E, and 0 TAC G8NO in Detorid, and all 5 stations in Omist. We would like to publicly recognize the invaluable assistance of our allies in this short yet brutal campaign, and thank them for their continued and unflinching support. So long, Lotka Volterra, and thanks for all the outposts." End quote. There were plenty among Lotka Volterra who wanted to continue fighting, but there were too few to buoy the alliance. Lotka shattered, and many of its most powerful corporations immediately joined up with Banner Brothers, seeing it as the best opportunity to get their revenge on Red Swarm. Critically, that included the corporation Shinra, which owned Lotka Volterra's surviving Titan. Red Swarm had conquered a huge swath of territory, 3 whole regions, but Banner Brothers was also a winner in the short term. It gained hundreds of passionate, skilled recruits who had hated Red Swarm as well as a fleet of capital ships in the Titan. In retrospect, we can see that the prophecy of Remedial and the Mitanni ultimately came true. They correctly foresaw that there was a brief window of opportunity to attack Lutka Volterra without Band of Brothers' intervention. East, West, and North. With Lutka in ruins, the Great War, as it was becoming known, became much more focused. It was now a fight between the greater Band of Brothers community and the rest of New Eden. Lutka Volterra fell in mid-March 2007, but Band of Brothers had been defending against attacks by the Northern Coalition since January when the T-20 scandal hit. Trapped between the Red Swarm in the east and the Northern Coalition in the north, Band of Brothers had to come up with a plan for fighting a two-front war. Now that the fall of Lutka Volterra had allowed Red Swarm to encroach on its eastern border. Band of Brothers up to stop the advance of Red Swarm and aid the fleeing Lutka while hiring Mercenary Coalition to head north to engage with the Northern Coalition. Mercenary Coalition's leader, Celine, announced MC's invasion of the North on the forums. For the last few weeks, my alliance had been taking care of some internal matters. With that now resolved, return our attention back to an area of space the Mercenary Coalition has not seen in quite some time. Mercenary Coalition has declared war on the Northern Coalition. Good luck to all. This should be a lot of fun. Be seeing you boys and girls soon. Celine, Executor of the Mercenary Coalition on January 25th, 2007. For its size, just a few hundred members, nobody in New Eden was more feared than Mercenary Coalition. It didn't have anywhere near the thousands of members Band of Brothers had, but it was able to strike with the same intensity. It made sense that the two would fight back to back and that Band of Brothers would trust the mercenary to single-handedly get the northern front of the war under control. Mercenary Coalition was renowned for its ability to disrupt its enemy's operation and for fighting outnumbered, so it was the perfect choice to head north to take on the large, inexperienced fleets of the Northern Coalition home front defense. While Mercenary Coalition's members viewed themselves as guns for hire, the rest of EVE universe viewed them as Band of Brothers lapdogs. In exchange for a chunk of period basis, it agreed to pay Band of Brothers with 1 month of free mercenary time per year. Band of Brothers could call in a slice of that debt whenever it was needed. I quote, "When Sir Molly really called the chips in was when he wanted us to go put a dent in an NC in the north," said Mercenary Coalition's leader Celine. This was when things were really kicking into high gear. Mercenary Coalition was outnumbered by the massive Northern Coalition, but was able to fight above its weight and hold its own. For its part, the massive Northern Coalition wasn't concerned about this small-scale attack from Mercenary Coalition. It designated one of its constituent alliances to deal with the mercenaries, and business went along as usual in the north, except for Mercenary Coalition's notable success in shutting down trade routes to Empire space. But with this happening, the Northern Coalition as a whole, was preparing itself for what it knew would be a war of epic proportions. One of its main leaders addressed the pilots of his corporation and asked them to prepare for an unprecedented war. Pilots of Morsus Mihi, I quote, by the way, "Within the next 24 hours, we will begin moving forces against our most hated enemy. This will be the hardest fight you have ever had in your history in EVE. It will be bloody and a long campaign, but we will not fail. And the Brothers as an alliance is the target. The total destruction of them is the only objective. We will not stop until victory is achieved. Good hunting." Fluff, leader of Morsus Mihi, Northern Coalition, on a date unknown. While Mercenary Coalition was still in the throes of combat against the Northern Coalition, all the way up in Pure Blind, it was attacked in force in its home region of period bases by the fleet of the notorious Russian player Evil Thug and his alliance against all authorities. Evil Thug targeted Mercenary Coalition for being a Band of Brothers ally. Usually Mercenary Coalition was safeguarded in the cocoon of Band of Brothers territory, but in late February 2007, Band of Brothers was busy in the east trying to help Lutka Volterra. What remained of it turned the tide against Red Swarm Federation. Evil Thug led his fleets into mercenary coalition space and made his declaration of war using what little English he knew. In the forum thread titled MC Mercenary Coalition, he just wrote one word: die. Mercenary Coalition's pilots abandoned the attack on the Northern Coalition and rushed back home to period bases and staged a defense with, again, a massively outnumbered fleet, and held their own beside a defensive starbase loaded with artillery guns. It would take more than just against all authorities to break the home base of Mercenary Coalition. Stop cold. Evil Thug sought aid to break the entrenched position of Mercenary Coalition. He found an ally in the Northerners who took this moment to launch the beginning of fleet hostilities against Band of Brothers and its allies. The very pilots whom Mercenary Coalition had just spent a month attacking were now free to fly a fleet directly into Mercenary Coalition's home system in period bases and assault its capital shipyards. With the Northern Coalition now in the fray, Mercenary Coalition could no longer hold a defense, and on March 14, it lost a shipyard where it had been building a valuable mothership. At that point, we went fucking bananas, said Celine. We went to Sarmoli, and we said, we're all in. The combined forces of Against All Authorities and the Northern Coalition had bloodied the nose of Mercenary Coalition, but also strengthened the ties between the mercenaries and Band of Brothers. What was once an employer-employee, renter-landlord relationship was now a true alliance between two of the scariest fighting forces in the game. We knew that the coalition of a mercenary home space being attacked existed, but the reality of it actually happening awoke something inside my alliance that is hard to describe, wrote Celine in a retrospective blog post. It awoke a sense of purpose and a terrible anger. The Northern Coalition's actions against us only lit the fires of vengeance in the eyes of Mercenary Coalition pilots. Mercenary Coalition's capital shipyards and period bases were hit. Inside was an incomplete Hell, a class of mothership, conferred by Celine a few days later. However, the NC would regret fucking with Mercenary Coalition in the very near future, as MC would descend upon them like the wrath of God. Groen Swarm History Logs. The bulk of the fighting forces of the Northern Coalition stayed in the south to hammer Band of Brothers' territory, but Mercenary Coalition had other plans. The stated aim of Mercenary Coalition was now to burn the north and to make sure this type of attack on its home region could never happen again. This was a happy coincidence for Band of Brothers, which had been having devil of a time itself dealing with Northern Coalition incursions into its territory. Several Northern Coalition members' alliances were attacking Band of Brothers on multiple fronts, with small fleets hitting Quarius and Cloud Ring, and the brunt of their forces attacking Fontaine. Band of Brothers pilots expressed a sense of hopelessness, wondering how they could possibly manage to defend their territory with the whole of New Eden attacking them. The first step was to take the fight to the Northerners' home territory. I quote, "Today, the Mercenary Coalition accepts the largest contract in our history. As of downtime today, the Mercenary Coalition is officially in the employ of Band of Brothers Alliance with the purpose of assisting them and their allies against the Northern Coalition. Said contract will last until the terms of completions are met. This decision is made with the full knowledge of the current EVE political landscape. We understand and accept this reality as the greatest challenge ever presented us by a client. On a personal note, I'd be lying if I didn't admit the feeling pushed into this a little. The incessant attacks against Mercenary Coalition assets serve no purpose other than provoke exactly this response." Celine, Mercenary Coalition, February 27, 2007. The Northern Coalition was perfectly justified in launching a retaliatory attack on Mercenary Coalition space. But Mercenary Coalition didn't see it that way. They saw themselves as blameless hired guns. In the middle of all of this, Northern Coalition was shaken by a defector, a German alliance called U-What that had broken from the Northern Coalition months earlier and now declared its intent to side with Band of Brothers in the coming hostilities. I wasn't able to reach UWAT for an interview, but the speculation among players of that era is that UWAT saw that the Northern Coalition could hardly defend itself against the lone mercenary coalition, let alone the full brunt of Band of Brothers, and felt compelled to diplomatically align itself with the stronger side. In the region of Cloud Ring, UWAT space now constituted the front line. Cloud Ring was the dividing region in the west that separated Band of Brothers and mercenary coalition from the whole of the south. With the situation in the north ready to explode, Red Swarm Federation decided it was time to come to the aid of the Northern Coalition, honoring its mutual defense back against Band of Brothers. Red Swarm gathered its fleets, loaded up freighters with ships and war equipment, and set up a course for the northwest. It was going home again, back to Cloud Ring, the first place Goon Swarm ever captured territory. I quote, "People of XZH, I have returned. Sesvan Qua upon arriving at XGH." Just 3 hours after UWAT declared its intention to side with Band of Brothers, 130 Goon Swarm pilot was dispatched from the main Red Swarm force and arrived in UWAT's home system, quickly locking it down. UWAT pilot Vasily Z, a veteran of several major alliances, noted sadly, "I go to Veritas, Goon takes my space. I go to Lutka, Goon takes my space. I go to UWAT, Goon takes my space." Red Swarm got the main system of Cloud Ring under its control, but its American members never managed to coordinate their attacks with the Northern Coalition, which was largely a European group. And now a very angry mercenary coalition was on its way back north, seeking revenge for the Northern Coalition attack on its home system. Within days, Red Swarm was forced to retreat, unable to sustain a war so far from home without the concerted help of its Northern Coalition allies. Mercenary Coalition had set up shop in UWAT's Cloud Ring and was ready to invade the north. Invading the north. The Mercenary Coalition fleet arrived in tribute in late March and tore the landscape apart. It ripped through every pilot it could find, from humble Northern Coalition miners to the official defense fleets. Within 2 weeks, over 1,000 Northern Coalition ships were destroyed, while Mercenary Coalition's own losses were negligible. While the main combat fleets of the Northern Coalition were busy attacking Band of Brothers and their allies in the south, Northern Coalition space was left with very little defense, and Mercenary Coalition took advantage of the situation. It wasn't enough to blow up some miners and blundering militia gangs. Mercenary Coalition wanted to change the face of the North forever. I quote, "We went up there to skirmish and fight, but eventually we realized we needed to do something different and start taking stations," said Mercenary Coalition Celine in 2014. Hey Skull, thanks for the follow. In mid-April 2007, the Mercenary Coalition-led forces moved out of Tribute, where they had been hunting convoys and stray ships, and moved into Fate to begin an official assault. I quote, "The first station we tried to take turned into this insane 3-hour-long battle one Saturday night. Celine recalled, by a miracle of a million different factors, we didn't just come out on top. We absolutely crushed them. It was like 70 of us versus 250 of them. They jumped into 70 battleships against 4 motherships and a dozen carriers and got shredded. Absolutely shredded. Video still survives from this battle, and it shows the Mercenary Coalition predilection for carriers and mothership strategies. Its drones blanket the screen, with each carrier unleashing as many as 15 drones, and each mothership with as many as 25. Mercenary Coalition didn't have the numbers for a head-on battleship attack, so it had to supplement with unmanned craft. Though drones do little damage individually, Mercenary Coalition deployed hundreds at a time, and the swarms ripped through the Northern Coalition's battleship fleet in minutes. This was becoming the norm of the Northern Front. Mercenary Coalition was achieving great things in the northern region, but it's important to take many of their claims of success with a grain of salt. Many of Band of Brothers' Mercenary Coalition's adversaries from this time disagree with Celine's account of Mercenary Coalition storming of the north. I think it's important to understand that Mercenary Coalitions existing as mercenaries relied heavily on propaganda, said Blazda, a leader within the Northern Coalition. They had to be known by prospective customers throughout Eve and to be known for being capable. They surely were able, but still everything they said was carefully massaged and inflated as much as possible. He used to drive our members mad. End quote. Some specific details are agreed upon by both sides. However, one night in C4C Tag C4 in the Fade region, Mercenary Coalition and a few minor Band of Brothers allies began a siege of Northern Coalition starbase when reports came in that the Northern Coalition was amassing a fleet to deal with the attack. Obviously outnumbered, the Band of Brothers allies decided to continue the siege anyway and see if the Northern Coalition would have the courage to warp into their position. As the Mercenary Coalition dreadnoughts went into siege mode and fired on the starbase, the Northern Coalition jumped its own fleet right on top of their position. The Northern Coalition's 100-strong fleet included dozens of capital ships and a brand new Titan. Its dreadnoughts entered siege mode as well, and the two sides began trading volleys. The Northern Coalition was able to destroy the first two Mercenary Coalition dreadnoughts quickly, but as it began to chew into the third, the infamous drone cloud appeared as the motherships and carriers launched their fighters. The Northern Coalition's Titan loosed its doomsday weapon and wiped the field clear of both enemy and allied drones and fighters. But it was too soon. There were still plenty of drones and fighters left in the base of the Mercenary Coalition carriers and motherships. More and more of them swarmed out like angry bees and covered the battlefield once again. With the battle for C4C beginning, the turn in Mercenary Coalition's favor, the Northern Coalition fleet commander Darth Sith faced a choice: put his dreadnoughts back into siege mode and keep fighting, or escape before finding out how this battle might end. I quote, "I smacked the siege button again and rolled that flaming horse right down the River Styx," Darth Sith wrote the next day. When the smoke cleared, Mercenary Coalition had taken control of the system. The wrecks of 11 Northern Coalition dreadnoughts floated through space alongside 4 of their carriers. By comparison, MC lost only 4 dreadnoughts. By 2007, capital ships like dreadnoughts and carriers had become much more common thanks to increased production from the industrial arms of the 3 big coalition. Still, 15 capital ships were too many to lose in a single engagement, especially when only 4 enemy ships were destroyed in return. Battles like this got the attention of everyone in Band of Brothers, and as will happen, other players started jumping on the bandwagon. They volunteered in droves to fly in these fleet operations. Now Mercenary Coalition was no longer the little fleet that used strategy to make up for its size. Now, it was in command of 200 ship fleets and was dominating in the north. The mercenaries' new allies weren't the only ones who got the message. The Northern Coalition, who had been tasked with attacking Band of Brothers' territory in Aquarius and Fountain, were suddenly worried about losing their home regions. Northern Coalition leaders commended them to stay in enemy territory and to accept that losing some home turf was necessary for the larger war effort. But not everyone listened. Some pilots went home to defend and evacuate their personal assets. The desertions weakened the Northern Coalition offense and defense simultaneously. With pilots abandoning their mission, the attacking fleets no longer carried their earlier heft, and as a result, Band of Brothers could afford to send pilots to fight in the north. With fleet discipline in disarray, the northern regions began to fall like dominoes, and within weeks the entire balance of power in the northern half of the map was upset. We had to actually start giving stations away to allies because we didn't have the capability to hold them, Celine told me. That made Sir Molly really happy. For a while, we're probably his favorite people in the game. Mercenary Coalition began ripping through the inexperienced Northern Coalition defense fleet without mercy. The statistics for this month for war are incredible. It destroyed 1,719 battleships while losing only 160. Carriers were destroyed and lost at a 3.6 to 1 ratio and dreadnoughts 5 to 1. The restructuring of the North. Fade and Vino were invaded in early April, followed by Declane 10 days later. Within a month, the 3 southernmost regions of the North were under the control of Mercenary Coalition and the allied forces of Band of Brothers. The Northern Coalition's fleet commanders could do nothing to stop the overwhelming assault, and by June their main forces were locked into the back of Branch and Tino with their days seemingly numbered. The mercenary coalition fleets pressed the fight even though they were beginning to suffer from battle fatigue as the invasion dragged on. For a brief few days, the entire north, Fade, Declane, Branch, Tino, Venal, and Cloudring, was under the control of Band of Brothers and its allied forces. Led by mercenary coalition, however, territory isn't the only way to judge the health of an organization. The Northern Coalition was forever changed by this war, but its union was still strong. The core constituent alliances were still dedicated despite having been temporarily removed from ownership of their own territory in the course of a long, messy war. The Northern Coalition fought back, and several of its constituent alliances carved out spaces for themselves in the coming days, reconquering the territory taken by Mercenary Coalition. It would be a long time before the Northern Coalition reclaimed its former stature, but throughout it all, its pilots kept up the assault on Band of Brothers' home turf in the south even as the north burned. The Northern Coalition did suffer some major casualties, though. Dusk and Dawn, one of its main military alliances, was destroyed. In the following forum post, Dusk and Dawn leader announced the dismantling of his alliance while paying respect to his Northern Coalition ally alliances, Morsus Mihi and Razor Alliance. I quote, "From today, Dusk and Dawn, D2, is no longer an operative entity. In the last 14 months of our history, our pilots had times of fun, times of desperation, and times of tiredness. At the end, we saw the universe changed, and it's no longer a place for Dusk and Dawn. Many thanks to our close friends who stood on our side the last year, especially to all honorable pilots of Razor and Morsus Mihi who had the pleasure to fly with. Overon, Director of Dusk and Dawn on June 4th, 2007. The Northern Coalition as a political entity was wounded, but its manpower remained. Their home territories were in bad shape, but they still had fleets and pilots that would prove invaluable in the next stage of the war. In the south, Red Swarm had dealt a heavy blow by destroying the once mighty Lotka Volterra. In the north, the allied of Band of Brothers forces had also dealt serious damage to the Northern Coalition. The greater Band of Brother community briefly controlled a swath of territory nearly as large as all of the other forces of New Eden combined, and most of the rest belonged to Red Swarm and its allies. This great war was nearing the end of its first year of hostilities, and this was only the beginning. It was already becoming known as the most fascinating conflict ever waged over the internet.